The Daas Zekeinim at the end of Parshas MATOS Maseh, in the case of Ori Miklot. Daas Zekeinim brings very interesting piece. It seems to be slightly disjointed and maybe not completely related. It's hard to see in actual fact what to connect the dots, so to speak. So again, the Daas Zekeinim tells us a piece at the end of Parshas MATOS Maseh, talking about Lo Tzikchu Kofer. You should not take a ransom for an atonement, financial atonement, to commute a death penalty, or for murder, or for accidental murder. If a person is liable, capital punishment, or is liable to go to the cities of refuge for having killed accidentally, that is a sentence that he has to endure and suffer, and it cannot be ameliorated by paying financial compensation in any way. So, commenting on that, the Daas Zekeinim is going to go into an extensive discussion actually of David HaMelech and Yoav. So he starts off with Yoav, the story of Yoav. Yoav, we'll get to it, in the time of David HaMelech, he killed certain people. He killed Uriah, he was responsible for Uriah Hitti, we'll see, and for Avner. And David, at the end of David's life, when Yoav was still alive, David instructed Shlomo, his son, his final ethical testament, let's say, was to Shlomo. One of the instructions was to make sure that Yoav now is brought to justice and is killed for having killed himself, for Yoav having killed Avner. And upon David's death and Yoav becoming aware of this, Yoav sought refuge from the din of Shlomo. He ran to the Mizbech, he ran to the altar to try and hold on to the horns, the corners of the altar. That was considered a place of refuge. A person could find refuge there. Says Ochaz Bekarnes Mizbech. So Tosfos brings that there's no compensation. A person cannot ameliorate or commute his sentence in any way. If it's a death sentence or a person has to go to exile, that in no way can be excommunicated or substituted or ameliorated in any way. Even if a person holds on to the corners, the horns of the altar, that in no way will provide refuge, as was the case of Yoav. Because it says, even if you're a kohen performing the service on the altar, you have to be taken to your death sentence. So certainly holding on just to the corners of the altar is going to be insufficient. And Tosfos now brings, that's what Yoav did. He ran to, when he heard what's going to happen, took refuge in the Mishkan there, and he held on to the he held on to the corners of the altar. So Daas Zekeinim asks, hey, Yoav is a Talmid Chacham. Tachkimune he's called. Roish HaShlishi, he was one of the greatest Talmidei Chachamim of his generation, if not the greatest. He surely knew that if a person is liable to a death sentence, then even if he's holding on to the altar, even if he's serving on the altar, he has to be taken from there to his death sentence. So why is he thinking he's going to find refuge attaching himself to the altar? Says Daas Zekeinim, no, Yoav had an alternative. He had a cheshbon, he had some form of calculation involved here. What? He said, there's a difference. If I'm going to be slain while holding the corners of the altar, while holding onto the altar, is going to be a difference. That what? That will be considered either if I am not holding onto the corners of the altar and I am given my death sentence as Yoav, that's considered death penalty, capital punishment that was executed through the high court. If a person is executed through the high court, he's not entitled to be buried b'kivrei avosav, together with the grave of his family. If, however, I was just killed, so to speak, by the king, whatever, but not through an official act of court, a sort of extrajudicial type of killing, that I will not forego my rights as Yoav to be buried B'kivra Avoisov with his forefathers. And that's what he sought to achieve. He said, I'm going to hold on to the altar, and that they will not take me away, they will not charge me and try me in Beis Din, in court, rather put me to death on the spot. That will suffice, that I will be able to be buried with my forefathers. That was Yoav's cheshbon, that was his calculation, that was his motive. And they accepted that, Shlomo accepted that. And Shlomo said, Poga boy, yeah, kill him, execute him there on the spot. And that will be sufficient. I will have cleared the blood for which Yoav was liable. So now Daas Zekeinim goes into the whole story. Why was Yoav actually executed? Why was he killed? What did he do wrong? So he brings initially, rather strangely, rather interesting, the story of when David instructed Shlomo. He says, you know what Yoav ben Tzruya did to me? David says, in his final ethical will, in his deathbed, he says to Shlomo, introducing him as a preface to the instruction to kill Yoav, he says to Shlomo, you know what Yoav did. So what did he do? What did he do? So Daas Zekeinim brings, what did Yoav do to David? It was the story of Uriah Hitti. Uriah Hitti was the husband of Bathsheba. Uriah was married to Bathsheba. And David sort of fell for Bathsheba. And the whole story obviously has to be understood. But he instructed Uriah, whatever, he told him to come, to go home. He felt that Uriah had not treated him with respect. Therefore he felt Uriah has to be himself put to death for having disobeyed the king. But he's not going to do it directly. And David was very much criticized for this, harshly criticized. But what did David do? He said the way he's going to get rid of, in inverted commas, of Uriah Hitti, he sent him onto the battlefront. And he sent a message to Yoav, who was the general in the battlefront at that time. He said to Yoav, take Uriah. He sent Uriah on a mission, go to the battle, bring this letter to Yoav. And the letter itself said to Yoav, I, David, am instructing you, Yoav, to place Uriah on the battlefront at a dangerous point. And maybe, I think it was, you should always draw at a critical time, leaving Uriah there. And he will be subject to the missiles that will rain upon him from the enemy above. And that will inevitably kill him. And that's what happened. And Daas Zekeinim brings the pasuk in Shmuel that describes all the Giborim, all the strong men of David. It recited and makes a whole listing of all David's powerful generals, and Uriah Hitti was the 37th. He was one of the generals. And what happened? Because Yoav put this senior general, Uriah Hitti, he performed David's instruction, and as a result Uriah died, and the people were distressed. Your negligent action, Yoav, has caused us to lose one of our prime senior generals, Uriah Hitti. Why did you do this, Yoav? And Yoav had received instruction from David. So what did Yoav do? He showed them the letter. Listen, I received a specific instruction from the king. That's what I meant to do. So he revealed the secret. This was a secret instruction. Yoav was not meant to reveal it. Because of that, this is what it seems Yoav had done to David. This is how Tosfos seems to explain it. Tosfos asked, what did Yoav do that David says to Shlomo, Yoav has to be put to death? And he explains, the Daas Zekeinim explained, that Yoav revealed the secret letter that contained the instruction that Uriah has to be mufkar. He has to be sort of abandoned at the battlefront, so he'll certainly die. That was, just checking it's running, that was what Yoav did wrong. He revealed this secret letter. And it's a pella, you could ask, what do you mean? This wasn't a completely immoral, inappropriate instruction that David issued to Yoav. And Yoav, in the first place, should never have perhaps executed that instruction. And if he did, he's fully entitled to say, I was acting on orders. I received a specific order from on high, from David. I am not fully culpable, maybe partially culpable, but you have to understand the circumstances. I was given this order, that's why I performed this. It's David really who gave this instruction from on high. Why was Yoav so out of line that David holds him guilty for having revealed this secret letter? Taisus doesn't answer that, but we're going to suggest Taisus, there is an answer. Of course, there must be an answer to this. And then Taisus goes on to a whole narrative. We have to see what Taisus says. Daas Zekeinim says. It says, in that context in Shmuel, it's Shmuel Beis, Perek Chaf Gimel, it says, in that context, Hashem got annoyed with his people, with Yisrael, and he tempted Vayoses. He incited David to do something inappropriate. What? To count the people. Lemono, says Yisrael. Hashem got annoyed with the people, and he incited David to count Yisrael. And we know the Torah tells us, don't count Yisrael. Don't count the head. Don't make a head count of Yisrael. We always say, Hashiach Samecho. Don't count heads directly. And if you're going to do it, the Torah says, when you're counting Kisisa, Soish Ben Yisrael, when you count them, you have to take half a shekel, a coin. That's how you should make the counting. And David didn't do that. David made a head count of the people. And Hashem, because Hashem was annoyed with David. And Rashi brings there on the Pasuk in Shmuel, Rashi says, I don't know why Hashem was annoyed with David, that he incited him to make this error and to count the people. And Daas Zekeinim says, I do know why Hashem was annoyed with David. Hashem was annoyed with David because of Uriah. That's why he was annoyed with David. That's what he seems to be saying. That's why he's annoyed. Doesn't say unfortunately annoyed with David. Kobe Hashem was annoyed with Yoav. Rashi says, I don't know why he's annoyed. So I'll tell you why he's annoyed. He was annoyed, I think it's going to have to do with David. He was annoyed with David, maybe also with Yoav. He was annoyed because of what happened to Uriah Hittite. And based on this, says Daas Zekeinim, I understand an interesting anomaly in the verses, in the Psukim. In the whole continuation there, the flow of the Psukim, of the narrative there. What? Because in Shmuel it mentions the 36 generals of David, his Giborim, his men of power, and then it stops in the list. But in Chronicles and Divrei Yomim, it continues the list. And Daas Zekeinim ask, why is the narrative go like? Why in Shmuel does it list up to 36, 37, it stops? And then in Divrei Yomim, it carries on this list of the Giborim of David. Why is that the way the Bible, the Nach, narrates this issue? And Daas Zekeinim explains, it's because of these events. Because what happened was, the Psukim were describing all the senior generals of David, and it came to Uriah Hittite, and it stopped. The narrative stopped. Why? Because Hashem, so to speak, who is really authoring these Psukim, Hashem was upset. Uriah Hittite, wow, hey, look what happened to Uriah. He was killed through the actions of David and Yoav. This is very inappropriate. So he stopped counting the Giborim of David. And he carried on Divrei Yomim. What does that mean? So Daas Zekeinim explains what that's really telling us. It's like a mashal. He gives a mashal. A king told his servants, write to me a letter listing all my strong generals and everything they've done, all the acts of valor that they have performed. And they did that. The generals did that. His servants did that. And they brought it before him. And they read out this letter listing for the king all his generals and their acts of valor. And everyone was mentioned by name. And the king asked, yeah, but there's one guy missing. One of my generals is missing here. Where is he? And it transpired that he had been killed negligently. Because the other generals had failed to act responsibly to avoid. There'd been obviously some accident, perhaps in training or something, and it was through somebody's negligence. As a result of that, one of the generals had lost his life. And the Melech said, "Where is he?" They told him he was killed through this negligent accident. The king got very upset. He got so upset with his generals, with his servants, he took this letter and ripped it up. In his anger, "What have you done?" Rips up the letter. And he told them like this, he said to them, "Because of your negligence, I am offering you, you're going to be punished." What punishment? I'm offering you 3 punishments, one of 3. Either you're going to starve, or you're going to have to go into battle in a foreign land, or I myself am going to slay you very severely, very strongly. I'm going to slay you harshly. Choose your punishment. They all answer straight away, unflinchingly, unhesitatingly. We don't want to wish famine. We don't want to suffer being exiled into war in a foreign land. We want to be in the hands of the king, because ultimately the king, despite what he said, is a merciful king. And the king accepted this, and he slay some of them. And after it finished, he told them, "You know what, now carry on writing the letter. Finish and write regarding all my generals." Says Daas Zekeinim, that's what's happening here. That's the narrative here in Shmuel and Divrei Yomim. The Novi, who's a Kodesh Baruch Hu, he's writing inspired by Hashem. He starts listing the Giborim Shel David. When he comes to Uriah Hitti, who was killed through the negligence of David, before it says David's negligence, more than Pshias David. David's not just his negligence, it's a travesty. Hifzik, he stopped. The Novi stopped, like the king, ripped up the letter. "I'm upset, what's going on?" Hashem said, Hashem got annoyed, what's going on? What's with Uriah? He's been killed. And Hashem said to David, "I'm sorry, you're going to have to be punished. I'm offering you one of 3 punishments. Or famine, or you have to go to war in a foreign land, or dever, pestilence, dever, a plague." And he brought a plague. And David said, what was David's response? The famous response. Niplo Nabi Ad Hashem, Ki Rabim Rachamov. I don't want to take the famine. I don't want to take the war, being subject to war in a foreign land. I'm choosing the plague because I still remain in your hands, Hashem. That's up to you, Hashem. And for another reason as well, because the plague makes no distinction between the classes, between anyone. Rich, poor, strong, weak. The plague is indiscriminate. Because had David said to himself, if I choose Ra'ov, if I choose the famine, people will say, of course he chose the famine. He's got plentiful supplies, he's wealthy, he's the king. He's not going to be subject to the famine. And had David said, had I chosen war, also they would have said, David trusts in his Giborim, his own strong generals to look after him. He's nothing to worry about. Therefore he can choose that for the country. So David said, I'm choosing the plague, which makes no distinction. I am equally susceptible and vulnerable as everyone else. It seems to be, David said, locking himself in a room, cheder atum, locking himself up, putting plastic, wearing most sanitized, special, impervious, porous, double mask, with perspex. So David, that's not going to help. I'm equally vulnerable as everyone else. And that's what happened, that's what transpired. Hashem brought the plague, and after they had all been punished, like in the king, he punished them all, and then he carried on with the letter writing who his Giborim are. Similarly here, Hashem was annoyed, he brought the plague, he had stopped writing, the listing of David's Giborim. Then he carried on after the plague in Divrei Yomim, continued. Okay, Adka. Then the Daas Zekeinim carries on. Then, in actual fact, he wants to connect up, just to close final loops, strands of the story. In the Psukim, earlier Psukim, it wrote, "You Shlomo know what Yoav did to me. He killed Avner and Amasa." So here, this is in the context of the story of Uriah Hittite. After the story of Uriah Hittite, we have this speech by David. And David says to Shlomo, "You know what Yoav did," referring to the story of Uriah Hittite. You know what Uriah Hittite did. And then later on, David also adds what Yoav did to Avner. So Tyson asks, what's the connection? We're talking about what Yoav did in connection of Uriah, and now we're talking about what Yoav did in killing Avner. And what was the story of Avner? Avner was the nephew of Shaul, and he was his general. And Shaul was at war with David. And then after Shaul died, David became king, and there was still a warring faction led by Avner, who still opposed David. And then Avner came to make peace because of a fight he had with, I think, Ishboishes, and he came to make peace with David. And Yoav heard about it, Yoav disapproved, and Yoav went and killed Avner. So says the Daas Zekeinim, when Yoav killed, so Yoav killed two people. He killed Uriah, he also killed Amasa, but let's talk, he killed Uriah and he killed Avner. So, what happened? And when Yoav killed Avner, David cursed Yoav. Yoav killed Avner. Like we described, Avner came to make peace. Yoav heard about it, disapproved, killed Avner. David disapproved, and David cursed Yoav with a terrible curse that his descendants will always have people who are sick, people who have the most terrible diseases, and they were lame, crippled. That will always be the fate of the generations of the progeny of Yoav. And the Daas Zekeinim explains what actually happened. Because when David gave the instruction to Yoav to kill Uriah, so the people thought, they had a certain perception. They thought, just like David has killed Uriah, similarly, David was the one who was behind the murder of Avner. David instructed Yoav to kill Avner. Because we see David killed Uriah. Now we're going to see Uriah much later. You have to understand that. But essentially, they were saying it's the same David. The same streak in David. The same pathos, the same dynamic in David. That he instructs Yoav to kill his enemies. He wants Yoav to do his dirty work for him. He told him to kill. He told Yoav to kill, to dispose of Uriah. And Yoav also disposed of Avner. That must have been David's bidding as well. So David was very keen to disprove that, to distance himself from the actions of Yoav. Because they assumed, why would David have wanted this? Because Avner was related to Shaul. He was Shaul's camp. He was a nephew of Shaul. So presumably it would be in David's interest to have Yoav dispose of Avner. So David went to great lengths to show that he was not in any way party to that assassination. Therefore, how did he do this? David got up, David Yoav. He cursed Yoav. And he said to him, Al yikores mi beis Yoav. Yoav's children, descendants, will never cease to have Zav, not a leper, Zav u'mitzora, a leper, and the Zav, someone who has illness of emissions the whole time, blood emitting from his body, or other emissions. Maybe a hemophiliac, a type of hemophilia, perhaps. Machzir Pelach, there'll always be cripples in Yoav's family. And there'll always be those who perish by the sword. And there'll always be poverty. A terrible curse. Tragedy to the end of generations is what the fate that David wishes upon the descendants of Yoav. As David's means of proving to the people, I was in no way associated with the actions of Yoav. I'm completely distancing myself from what Yoav did. I'm cursing Yoav for what he actually did. And it says this worked. The people realized that this was not David's bidding, what Yoav had done. So now coming back to our events. Yoav is at the Mizbeach, holding on for dear life or for dear burial of life. He knows he's now been found guilty for what he did to Uriah and or to, let's say, to Avner. He's been killed for Avner's death. That's actually, it was in the bottom line. And David told now, David instructed Shlomo, you should kill Yoav for what he did. For what he did, his specific instruction to Yoav, to Shlomo, was actually to kill him for having killed Avner. And asked the Daas Zekeinim, why did David not kill Yoav? Why did he only curse him? Why did he not kill him? You've murdered Avner in cold blood. You Yoav are chayv mitzvah. So Daas Zekeinim gives an excuse, slightly lame, feeble excuse, namely, because he was ben achoisei. Yoav was also a nephew of David. Tzruya of Avigail. And since Yoav was related to David, he didn't want to kill him. Okay, you have to understand that. And then, when it came to actually executing, who performed the execution on behalf of Shlomo? David's instruction to Shlomo, you should kill Yoav, for Yoav having killed Avner ultimately. Who performed the execution? It was Benayahu. So when Benayahu approached Yoav, who was holding on to the Mizbeach for dear burial rites, Yoav said a message to Benayahu, go back and tell Shlomo something. It's not so straightforward. Tell Shlomo, you cannot inflict two punishments upon me. Namely, Im Targeni, you're going to kill me now. Let's say it's going to be for what I did to Yoav, to Avner. Then Kabel alecho aklolois, shekilalani David avicho. Then you have to accept the curses. I was cursed, David cursed me for what I did to Avner. So now you want to kill me, you want to execute me for that. Okay, you take the curses. David himself, you have to take the curses. You can't impose two penalties on me. And if you don't want to take the curses, you want me to have the curses, then you can't kill me. Don't kill me. Very sorry. You don't want to take the curses, then you can't kill me. And Benayahu brought this instruction back, this message from Yoav back to Shlomo. And Shlomo instructed him, yes, okay. Aseh kasher diber, do as he was instructed, as he instructed you. And that's a fact, yes, he executed him and he buried him. Because that was Yoav's wish, that he would merit a burial in his forefathers' graves. And in actual fact, having murdered him, having killed him, he had accepted the threat. Or it wasn't just a threat, it was an explanation. It was clarifying, the clarification, that if you, Shlomo, murder me, you're going to have to accept the curse. And in actual fact, that's what transpired. Let's just stop here. That's actually what transpired. Amar Rav Yehuda, Kol HaKlolois Shekilo David es Yoav, all the curses which David poured on Yoav. So, he should be a leper, he should be a mephiliac, he should be poor, he should fall by the sword. All these terrible curses, that will be an inevitable, enduring part of the legacy of Yoav's family. In actual fact, these all inured to David's family. Kol HaKlolois Shekilo David es Yoav, Niskaimu B'zari Shel David. David, his seed, his family, his progeny themselves suffered all these curses. And he goes through the list. I'm not going to go through it. Zov was Rechavam, who was a descendant of David. He became a Zov. Uziel became a Mitzoira. Asal was lame, went by a stick. Who fell by the sword of Yoshio. And he was killed with 300 spears that pierced him. who is poor was Yehoiachin. Yeah. Wow, okay. So this is a major Daas Zekeinim. Seems to take us, mamish, throws us Arba Kantvei, throws us from one end of David HaMelech and Yoav to the other, and he's talking all about Ori Miklot. So we want to try and understand what the Daas Zekeinim is telling us. I think he's telling us something very deep, something very important, something fascinating. So, where do we start? So briefly, we'll recap. He brings that you cannot accept in any way penitence, financial compensation for a death penalty. And then he brings, because even a person holding onto the altar cannot commute his sentence, certainly not by paying compensation. And yet Yoav held onto the altar for dear life. Did he think he was going to avoid death? And he says no, he just wanted to be buried with his forefathers, were he to be executed by Beis Din, that would not have happened. And then he goes into a long discussion. Daas Zekeinim goes into a long discussion of Yoav, what Yoav did wrong, why he actually was deserving of the death penalty. He seemed to sort of go off on a tangent. Oh, Yoav, let's talk all about Yoav. And he goes into this whole discussion about Yoav. What was it Yoav did wrong? That he showed the letter. David gave an instruction that Uriah should be executed by Yoav, and Yoav did that, and then they were upset with Yoav. So Yoav showed them the letter. That was what Yoav did wrong. We asked, well, what's wrong with showing them the letter? That's David did wrong. Shouldn't have given this instruction. And then it brings Hashem was annoyed. And Rashi asks, why was Hashem annoyed with David? And Daas Zekeinim brings, he was annoyed because of this action. And what did he do? He calls David to count Klal Yisrael. And counting Klal Yisrael brings a plague. And the Gemara asks, how could David make such a basic mistake? It's a pasuk in the Torah, because David was perhaps making light of the Pesukim. Anyway, David made this tragic error, counted the Klal Yisrael, because Hashem was annoyed with David, because he had done this action to Uriah, and he caused David to make this mistake. He counted Klal Yisrael, and the Daas Zekeinim explains what it was. It's like a king. He explains the narrative that the pasuk in Shmuel, Samuel, the prophet, lists all the Giborim, all the strong men of David, gets to the 37th, who was Uriah, stops, and carries on in Divrei Hayomim. Suddenly breaks off abruptly the listing and continues it in Divrei Hayomim. Why? So it's like a king who was presented with a list of all his Giborim, and when they were being listed, he noticed one of them was not there, and he said, what about him? And said he was killed negligently. The king got very upset, rips up the letter, says, I'm offering you a punishment, either famine or war, you have to go to war, or I myself are going to execute you. And they said, we want you, the king, to be the one executing us, because you are merciful. Similarly, David, this is what happened. Hashem maybe is going through his Giborim, he hears that Uriah has been killed negligently. Hashem gets upset, threatens David, what you want, famine or war or a plague? And David says, I want to fall into your hands, Hashem, because with famine I will be protected, I'm rich, I'm wealthy, there'll be a perception that I'm looking after my own interest. If it's war, the perception will be I can defend myself in my palace. But the plague does not make distinctions between anyone, and therefore David chose the plague. And afterwards, after the plague, it resumed the narrative, the listing of the Giborim of David, the strong men, in Divrei Hayomim. And then finally Tosfos went on to describe that, in actual fact, it then went on to talk about Avner. David instructed Shlomo to kill Yoav because Yoav himself had killed Avner, and Avner had came to make peace from the camp of Shaul, and David was keen to show that he was not associated with this assassination on the part of Yoav of Avner. So how did David do this? By cursing Yoav. So when it came finally, eventually, for Shlomo to send a messenger, Benayahu, to execute Yoav for having killed Avner, Avner told Shlomo via Benayahu that if you want to execute me, you can't do both. You can't kill me, execute me, and leave the curse. either one or the other, pick. If you want to execute me, you have to accept the curse. Otherwise, leave me in the curse. And he executed him, and in actual fact, the curse inured to David. That's a summary, basically, of what we've seen here. So what's this all telling us? What's the Daas Zekeinim coming to tell us? So I think let's get to the heart of it. The heart of it is the story, the narrative. One point though, we'll say one side point. What was it? No, it's part of the main point. So I think it's not even a side point. It's going to tie in nicely. The heart of it is this narrative. This king, let's talk about the mashal. That should give us the insight into what's really going on. The mashal, the parable was a king hears about the list of his servants. The servants given a list of the general. One of them is missing. What happened? He was killed inadvertently. King rips up the list of Giborim and offers them a choice of punishments, famine, going to war in a foreign country, or you yourself, the king, will execute, and they choose execution. King does that and then reads the list again. So what's happening? Seems to be perhaps saying like this. The king is upset. Why? You've been negligent. You allowed one of my generals to be killed negligently. It's not just a loss of life, says the king. It's a loss of life of my general. You were not careful sufficiently with the honor, with the life of my general. This is indicative of perhaps a deeper malady. That you yourselves do not value those who are identified with the king. Perhaps you yourself do not truly, fully, wholly identify yourselves with the king's interests. You're looking after your own interests. This is just another person. If he gets killed, it's not the end of the world. So he's a servant, he's in the service of the king. It's not the end of the world. That does not mean much for us. If he's in the service of the king doesn't mean much for you, then you being in the service of the king doesn't mean much for you. Says the king, this is the problem. Therefore the king rips up the whole letter. Says, these are my Giborim, they're not my Giborim. They're not my men. They're not the king's men. They do not identify, they do not perceive themselves as the king's men. You do not perceive yourselves as my faithful, trustful servants, says the king. Rips up the letter. Offers them a punishment. You can go and have to suffer at the hands of famine, at the hands of a foreign enemy, or I myself will slay you. And they chose to say, the king, you will slay you, because you're merciful. What they're saying is like this. The king says, yeah, I'm going to execute you. If you're going to be subject to famine, that's a foreign agent. You're going to be subject to a war in a foreign country, that's a foreign agent. You're going to be subject to my decree, my bringing upon you a death sentence, that's my decree, says the king. And that has got a major effect. Why? Because some of you are going to be slain. And essentially all of you are liable to be slain. But I'm merciful, some of you are going to be spared. And they say we're confident some of us will be spared. But not just that. There's going to be a profound change. As a result of the king, in his wrath, slaying many of them, but sparing many of them, those who are spared now become revived, resurrected new people. They are the people whom the king spared, or the people who the king resurrected. They are the people who the king, almost so to speak, brought back to life, gave a new right to live. And as such, they are people who have been resurrected by the king. They have a new identity. They are the king's men. They truly now have acquired a new, perhaps, an identity of truly the king's men. And from now on are perhaps capable of loyalty. And this is why they chose this punishment. They understood what the king was saying. And the king therefore said, now I'm going to carry on reading the letter. I'm going to rewrite the letter. And yes, you are all my Giborim now. Now, all of you are once more reinstituted. You've resurrected yourselves. You've resurrected your honor as the king's, truly the king's men. So why did the king offer them a choice in the first place? Why didn't he just say, I'm going to execute you, and some of them I won't execute you? Because the king, it had to be that they choose this. It has to be they say, we want this punishment to be executed by the king. He's merciful, and we know he's going to keep some of us alive, and that's going to actually be the true tikkun, the true remedying of this situation. Because afterwards, whoever remains alive is going to be the king's man. But that's only if we choose of our own volition to allow the king to bring us to a better place, to allow us the king to resurrect us as the king's people. That's why the king tested them, I'm offering you this, and they realized where they had erred, and they say, yes, we're choosing life through death, through potential death at the king's hands. And this is what happened with David. When David caused the death, brought about the death of Uriah, so Hashem was upset. Because this shows, this is David, in actual fact, abusing his authority. Abusing his role as the king for his own ends. Therefore, he's using his authority as David to attain his own personal benefit. He wants to marry Bathsheba. He disposes of Uriah on the pretext of Uriah having done something wrong. Hashem sees through this charade. He says, David, you're acting in your own interests. You perhaps yourself, David, have become the victim perhaps of your own power, of your own authority that's gone unchallenged. So Hashem says now, we're reading the Giborim of David, who are the Giborim of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because it's the Novi who's listing them. Hashem says, Hashem rips up the letter. Hashem says, I don't want, these are not my men. These are David's men. David has taken them for his own. Since he's taken them as his own, they're not my men. Hashem says, Hashem, stop reading, stop the narrative now. I don't want to hear any more about the Giborim. And then Hashem in anger turns to David and says, I'm offering a punishment. Famine or war or plague. And David correctly and appropriately chooses the plague. He says, I want to fall into your hands, Hashem. Because I know you're merciful. And I want to be in your hands, Hashem. And when Hashem is finished with the plague, the narrative continues. In Divrei Hayomim, Hashem says, okay, now I can continue. They have been atoned. Why? Now they are once more. David himself realizes he has to be a part of the plague equal to everyone else. He has to suffer the dangers of the plague ravishing also even David himself, such that at the end, if David will survive, he has been resurrected as Hashem's faithful servant. And when that happens, David chooses his appropriately. So Hashem says, okay, let's continue with the narrative. Let's talk about now, continue with the listing of David's strong men, because these are now my men, my people. And this can explain perhaps what it was. How did Hashem bring about, how did Hashem express his anger to David? Hashem said to David, he was angry with him, he caused David to count the people. That's what brought about the plague. Seems to go together. Hashem said choose a plague, and he also caused David to count the people. And why did David make such a mistake? How could David? It's a pasuk, you don't count the people. You don't make a head count of Klal Yisrael. How does David do it? This was a mistake of David. The prohibition is, it says in the pasuk that Vayosis is David limnois es Yisrael. But it says show you the Sidi. Veichar af Hashem ba'om. With the people. Could be this pasuk is telling us like this, that this is a mistake David made. David made. He said, I'm viewing it. I'm the king, and they're my people. They're not Hashem's people. I'm not here. They're here for my authority is for my personal benefit. That was the mistake. That was the abuse of power. He no longer views them all as really the servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. No, I'm the king, and they're my people. We're no longer Hashem's people. Which case, says David, I can count the people, because the Isser is Ki Siza es Bnei Yisrael. Don't count a head count of Yisrael. David erred, he did not look at them anymore as Klal Yisrael, the people of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They're not the Am Hashem, they're my people, they're my servant, they're the Am. That was in that context, therefore, having subjected, abused his power, bringing about the demise of Uriah Hitti, the death of Uriah Hitti on the instructions of David, David has now created for himself a new paradigm that the people are his to be summarily executed in accordance with David's wishes. They're not the people of Hashem, they're David's people. So David inadvertently now thinks, why shouldn't I count them? Not Klal Yisrael. This is the error of David. So this seems to be the point that the Daas Zekeinim is bringing out. That how was this problem? How was this rectified? How was this error rectified? The problem is you view yourself. David is viewing himself. The people, the servants of the king, are viewing themselves as no longer subject to the authority of the king. We're not the king's men anymore. We're our own people. David is his own person. So Hashem says, if you choose a plague, put me in charge, make me as the executioner, the potential executioner, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that will be your resurrection. After that, if and when I have mercy on you, you become once again my people, the people whom I resurrected. You've renewed your status anew as my people. That's the narrative, that's the dynamic that's perhaps being explained here. Similarly, Yoav, in choosing to be executed, an extrajudicial execution rather than through judicial process, through Beis Din, says, if I'm executed by Beis Din, it's a similar notion, I'm not entitled to be buried b'kivrei avosav. Why not? Because if you're executed by Beis Din, that is not just being executed. It's like a death sentence on the whole person. Your whole mitzvah, the whole fabric of the person has been declared by the whole nation, as represented by the court, the high court, the Beis Din, as having to suffer the death sentence, as not being entitled anymore to be part of Yisrael, of the nation of Yisrael. A person for whom that has been decreed loses the right even to be buried with his forefathers. He's no longer part of the family lineage, he's no longer part of the people. He's lost it, he's everything. Because that's what the death sentence can do. The death sentence can actually take away the whole identity of the people. And if the death sentence is commuted, the person will re-emerge anew as a new person. If it is a sentence that is, so to speak, a truly potent sentence that has the ability to sort of take away and re-restore the life anew. And Yoav said, the implication is though, says Yoav, that if Shloimeh just kills me, this extrajudicial execution, that will not have that same effect. That's not a death sentence that sort of takes away my whole identity. I still am Yoav, who is Ben Tzruya, who is entitled to be buried b'kivrei avosav. Let's keep that point. Let's go to the end. What happens? Yoav says, ultimately, when he's presented with a death sentence from Shloimeh, who was instructed by David to kill Yoav for having assassinated Avner. And Yoav says, I've already been cursed by David, because David wanted to distance himself from this act, so he cursed me. And why didn't David himself execute Yoav? Because Yoav was a cousin, was a nephew. Says Yoav, you can't do both. You can't execute me and leave me in the curse. If you're going to execute me, then you have to take the curse. Otherwise, leave me in the curse. Can't do both. What does he mean? He says, if you execute me, you have to take the curse. Why not? Sikudle, learn by Pashtos. I don't have to suffer 2 sentences. I did one action, killed Avner. Because that one action of having killed Avner, says Yoav, you only have to suffer. That's a general rule. Person only has to suffer. There's only one action, one punishment. I don't have to suffer 2 punishments. And the only way that seems to be this punishment can be removed is you yourself, David, accept it. That's one way of learning it. I'm suggesting that Daas Zekeinim is coming to tell us something else, something deeper. Saying like this. And let's just go back to this one point. That the Daas Zekeinim started by telling us that what did Yoav actually do wrong? He revealed the secret letter that David sent to have Uriah killed. That was really what Yoav did wrong in the first place. His execution in the end, it seems to be, was for having killed Avner. But David was already very upset with Yoav for having revealed the secret letter about Uriah Hitti. And we asked, David himself was punished for what he did to Uriah, as we saw. It was completely inappropriate. So why are you punishing Yoav for defending himself in showing the letter that contained the improper instruction from David to Yoav? That's Yoav's best defense. That's a legitimate defense. Perhaps he shouldn't have carried out the order, but he was ordered it. This was David's bidding. So what did Yoav do so inappropriately? So you could say one of two things. First of all, Yoav himself says David does not obey my instructions. Yoav does not consider himself subordinate when he views as appropriate. He disobeys me, he killed Avner, which I was very upset with. In which case Yoav is considers himself an independent agent, and therefore he did not have to execute my instruction, and therefore it was inappropriate for him, when he did execute it, to blame it on me, to lay the blame on me. That's one way of learning it. Could also suggest another way. David is saying essentially Yoav has no rights. Because Yoav already killed in the history beforehand, killed Avner. And Yoav, for killing Avner, has to suffer a death penalty. And we're talking here about how the death penalty, we're going to see, is incommutable. It's something that, something can never be commuted, can never be excused, can never be pardoned, can never be redeemed. And therefore Yoav is absolutely chayiv to be killed, as ultimately happened in the end. In which case, David really has full right to execute Yoav. In which case, if David issues this instruction, Yoav really has no moral right to start blaming David to try and excuse himself and save his own skin. Yoav has no right to save his own skin. Yoav has no rights whatsoever. He's liable to be put to death for what he's done. Therefore, he has no excuse, no right whatsoever to show the contents of this letter to thereby save himself. But coming back to the curse now. Yoav says, either you accept the curse, and then you're entitled to kill me, or you're not entitled to kill me. So you could say it works like this. Because the death sentence for murder is such a powerful death sentence, and it can never be commuted with anything, can never be redeemed or pardoned in any way, like we're saying, such that it almost recreates the person, like we saw it so forceful. Says Yoav there, why did you, David, not kill me? Why did you not execute me? You had self-interest, you wanted my services, I'm your mishpacha, you knew I'm going to be faithful. Maybe David thought, this dynamic itself, he's really liable to be killed, and I will not kill him, and it will be as if I did kill him, I'll resurrect him, he'll be a new person. And that's why I do not have to execute him. But if that's the case, so why are you executing him now? You've got no right to do that. You should have executed him then. You were negligent, David. You failed to bring about the din, the execution that should have been brought about. And now you're saying, no, I was wrong all along. Really, Yoav should have been executed. Says Yoav, okay, if that's the case, then you, David, were extremely negligent in performing your duty of the Ors La Yechupa. The land will never excuse death. If you do not redeem the blood of somebody who's been killed, you do not bring to justice the murderer, the land will never excuse that, will never forgive you. And what did you, David? You didn't do that. And now maybe you understood that I'm not really liable for that. Because maybe you were involved in it, maybe you were happy about it, so you have no right to put me to death. But that's not an excuse. You can never introduce your own personal interests And you, David, if you now hold that really I was Chayiv Yoav, was Chayiv to be murdered, then you, David, have done a travesty in not bringing about justice in the time, at the appropriate time, in which case you, David, yourself should be cursed. If you hold that my din is one that I should not be cursed, I should be put to death straight away, in which case you, David, were so negligent in not executing the din, the death sentence that should have been, you are liable to be cursed yourself from that. And therefore, says Yoav, the curse that you sought to give to me, you should take it yourself. And if you don't want to take the curse, because you hold that maybe it was appropriate that you cursed me and you didn't kill me, so you're not entitled to kill me, you're not allowed to murder me. So this seems to be what the Daas Zekeinim is telling us. And why is the Daas Zekeinim telling us this now, this whole arichos? Now we can understand. Where do we start from? We started from Ori Miklot. Vim borach Ori Miklot. A person runs to Ori Miklot, he has to stay there, and he cannot have a sentence in any way ameliorated or commuted by money or any other means. And maybe the Daas Zekeinim now is going actually to the depths, plummeting the depths of what this law of Torah is telling us. Based on an explanation we gave, what is the idea of this punishment? Of sending the accidental murderer, the negligent murderer, but not deliberate, to cities of refuge. What's the idea of it? So we explained that it's the cities of the Leviim, and in the cities of Leviim they can learn how to conduct themselves. Because this accidental, this action, this careless, negligent action, almost willing action on the part of this murderer, this accidental murderer, was done as a result, we explained, of him being over-involved with his own self-interest, with furthering his own activities, being over-involved in with his own daladamas, with his own sphere of activity, without a thought for the consequences to other people. And coming to the cities of Leviim, it would train him in self-discipline, self-control, in not acting, not conducting himself with thoughts for his own material benefit. The Leviim themselves, we saw, they've got no possessions. They dedicate themselves to the service in the temple, which is very much about sacrifice. Person distancing themselves, limiting themselves, disciplining themselves from partaking of material pleasures of this world. That's the education that the person has in the Ori Miklat, in the cities of refuge. And maybe Daas Zekeinim is adding a very important dynamic, very important aspect to this. Maybe not enough for a person just to sit there. You go and sit in a town full of righteous people. Will that inevitably bring about the anticipated and hoped for change in your conduct? A person is a selfish person, self-interest person who has no consideration or no involvement, no awareness even of, no sensitivity to the interests, needs of other people. And you say to him, you go and live with a sense of people, a community of moral, selfless, sensitive, kind people, that will surely influence you to become yourself a more considerate, kind, moral person. Maybe yes, maybe no. I think we often see it doesn't. I think we often see that it doesn't work. Doesn't necessarily work. So maybe Daas Zekeinim is telling us there's another powerful dynamic here. The Torah is introduced. It's great infinite wisdom, divine wisdom. Telling a person to associate with moral, kind, sensitive people is not sufficient. However, if we have a situation where if you leave this sanitarium, if you leave this place of refuge, there's somebody who wants your life. Somebody who's desperate to kill you. There's a death sentence hanging over you. In which case, anywhere outside here, you're a dead person. There's no doubt whatsoever this person is going to track you down and ensure that your death is brought about. That maybe has the strong effect, according to this whole explanation that Daas Zekeinim has told us, Now that's so powerful that actually itself can resurrect the person. Can cause the person to become, so to speak, like a new person. Therefore, that perhaps is the hope of the Torah. We consign this person to the cities of refuge, and we have outside a death sentence, there's wanted signs all over the world, pasted all over Eretz Yisrael. This person is wanted alive or dead. Should he dare to exit by 1 meter even this city of refuge, he's a dead person. Therefore, inside, when he's inside, so to speak, we can assume that he is going to actually be undergoing this resurrection. He's lost his life. His life is essentially lost. His life in the outside, as far as the outside world is concerned, his life is finished. There's a death sentence on him. Therefore, we can hope that inside here, he's actually going to evolve a new resurrected, a new life based on, yes, the principles and the example of his fellow inmates, his fellow citizens, good citizens, such that when he does ultimately emerge, yes, he'll emerge as a new improved person. And that's really what the Torah is helping us to remedy. And that's maybe why the Torah, maybe Tosfos is pointing out, while the Torah has this very unusual punishment, this very unusual dynamic that we allow the person himself, the victim, the family of the victim of the accidental death himself, be the one to execute the death penalty here. Should he exit from the city of refuge? Normally it's up to Beis Din. Why is it left to the hands of the victim himself, of the family of the victim? Perhaps because the Torah is saying this adds an additional potency to this potential death. If it's left up to Beis Din, the authorities, maybe there's a limit to how vigilant they can be. They're not going to stand watching, perhaps, the city of refuge the whole time. A person might think he can escape. Maybe he would be able to escape and to avoid detection by the authorities. Whereas if there's a person himself has got this vengeance, who's so burnt up with a desire for revenge, that he is going to be waiting for any opportunity, for any notice whatsoever, any report that this person has dared to leave the city of refuge, he's going to be the first one to immediately find him and take the law into his own hands. He's allowed to execute him himself. Could be even a mitzvah at that point. The Torah therefore is saying we want to make it so much more powerful. This consignment, this prison sentence, you have to be consigned to the city of exile, such that you're actually your life is being taken away and given back a renewed, improved life. Maybe that's a message for society. Maybe it's combining, with the divine wisdom, combining compassion and strict judgment. Din and rachamim. Ultimately, we want this person to live. But if we have too much compassion, we say, okay, we'll lock you up in a sort of a penitence prison. You'll be allowed to come out certain times. You have certain privileges. That's maybe not sufficient. That's the hand of compassion. But it has to be accompanied with iron fist disciplining, putting the person in his place, helping the person to renew himself, to emerge ultimately a renewed and bettered person. Hope this can help us to also, in some ways, to act without having to have the threat of this execution over our heads, to ourselves be able to perhaps perceive this threat as from above the whole time, and thereby to somewhat help to improve ourselves. Thank you.